and welcome to today's program on Sri Lanka. Let me introduce to you the speakers. Frances Harrison is the director of the International Truth and Justice Project. For 2 decades, Frances Harrison was the BBC foreign correspondent for Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and Iran. Frances spent 4 years living in Sri Lanka while at the BBC. She has also worked at Amnesty International, OHCHR, and multiple UN commissions. Her book, Still Counting the Dead, Survivors of Sri Lanka's Hidden War, published in 2012, documents personal stories from the final phase of the war in Sri Lanka. Vasuki Nasaya teaches human rights, legal and social theory at NYU Gallatin School of Law, where she is also faculty director of the Gallatin Global Fellowship in Human Rights. She has published on the history and politics of human rights, humanitarianism, international criminal law, reparations, global feminism, and decolonization. Gahan Gunta Teleki is a Sri Lankan human rights lawyer and academic focusing on media freedom and ethno-religious violence. He is currently a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School. His latest publication is The Chronic and the Entrenched: Ethno-Religious Violence in Sri Lanka. He is a former research director at Verite Research and former advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sri Lanka. Thank you to our distinguished panelists. And thank you to Tim Franklin, our host and electronics guru for this program. Frances, will you start us off, please?
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me. I've been given the unenviable task of trying to give you a potted history of Sri Lanka, and I think it's unenviable because obviously there is no consensus on many of the things that happened, but please forgive me if you find there's a lot left out and a lot of things that you may not agree with. I mean, my organization has been looking particularly at the linkages between different periods of history in Sri Lanka. So this is a country that since independence has experienced 3 waves of mass atrocity violence, and that is 1971, 1987 to 9, and then 2009, the end of the civil war that Susan referred to. And well, we've been looking particularly at a lot of the information that was collected in the late 80s around the uprising at that point by leftist students and others, and that the way that was crushed by the Sri Lankan army, and the similarities between that and the way that the security forces have behaved subsequently against the Tamil nationalist struggle. And what we've found in looking at those linkages is the structural nature of the violence in Sri Lanka, and in many cases, the same individuals being involved in the violence. So we looked particularly at a district where there was a military coordinator who was responsible when there were hundreds and hundreds of disappearances in this very small district. And surprise, surprise, that man is now the president of Sri Lanka, and one of his subordinates is now the army commander of Sri Lanka, or is until next week the army commander of Sri Lanka. So you see that these people have learnt these patterns of violence in the past and repeated them. And I think those sort of linkages are very powerful and very interesting because, you know, at times as an organization, we've seen denial of ongoing violations of the nature of the kind of structural nature of the violence. And when you look back over the decades, you see that many of the same tactics were used by sometimes the same individuals and the same units, but against different groups of victims. So that kind of that level of violence and the interlinkages of it over the decades really say something very powerful about the difficulty of reform within Sri Lanka, which, I mean, I think Gahan and Vasuki will speak to. And in many cases, it's also about the fact that now over many decades, different political actors and groupings and individuals have been involved in different kinds of violence. And now none of them wants to hold each other accountable. And that becomes, you know, really a very serious problem at the moment. When we look back at the Civil War, I mean, you're talking about asking me for a history of the conflict. I'm still learning so much about what happened in 2009, the final phase of the Civil War, which is the phase that, I wrote the book about, that I've spent many, many years studying, and I'm still today meeting survivors from that war, and actually did today. And every time I sit down with someone and interview them, I find more knowledge about the units that were involved, the nature of the atrocities, the degree to which the violence, particularly at the end of the war, was planned, and how you can now see that, the kinds of weaponry used. So it's really very much a learning curve in terms of understanding how the security forces planned this kind of violence and executed it, and of course, how they then get away with it again and again. We're looking at the Civil War, you're talking about the last period of the war. Maybe I should just explain the kinds of things that we've been hearing again and again. Really, what you hear is a 6 months of a death march story. I mean, of people who have been displaced again and again from their homes, the most unimaginable levels of suffering. That, to me, it's extraordinary that there are protests in Colombo, and that this level of suffering and violence and atrocity is not, the killing is not at the absolute peak of the agenda. That I understand there is huge economic suffering, but the lack of knowledge of certainly the younger generation about what happened in the north and east of Sri Lanka, and particularly the north of Sri Lanka in 2009, is to me quite shocking, because you're talking about people who are still 12, 13 years later, deeply, deeply traumatized by what they saw. By the most extraordinary range of war crimes and crimes against humanity and suffering that people endured at the hands of the security forces, and also at the hands of the LTT. But when we look at what happened at the end of the war, that is the Sri Lankan army, and some of the things that happened and the level of accountability for that are really quite shocking. And I guess that's probably what drives me in the kind of work that I do, that looks at accountability for that period. And we've been, as an organization, gathering the evidence of victims, of insider witnesses, and of linkage evidence that links specific units to specific incidents in the war. And alongside us, obviously, the UN and other people have been doing this, and other NGOs. And it's taken years and years of meticulous, painstaking work to get to the point where we could actually bring universal jurisdiction cases abroad. So the first one that we tried was in Latin America in 2017 against the former army commander in Sri Lanka. And at the time, we had a lot of evidence around torture in the camp that he commanded. But unfortunately, that case, though the prosecutor was appointed in Chile, and in Brazil there was jurisdiction, there simply wasn't the political will in those countries to push those cases through. Sri Lanka was too far, too distant, too remote for people in Latin America who have their own history of violence and war and military dictatorship to really prioritize the cases there. And that was a pity that happened. The second case we brought was in California under the Torture Victims Protection Act, and that was on behalf of one named Tamil victim, and then another 10 anonymous Tamil and Sinhalese victims. And that, unfortunately, that was against Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who unfortunately then became president of Sri Lanka, which meant that he acquired head of state immunity. And so at that point, we had to withdraw the case in the hope that we could fight it another day if he was on American soil and no longer had head of state immunity. And, that case also, that was really regrettable, because it was a very, very difficult case to persuade people to, want to actually be part of it, because they were so scared about the process. And that was a civil case, obviously. But even then, the level of fear in getting people to come forward and participate in these processes, even many years after the events, is still very difficult. It's one of the more difficult things I do in my job, is approach witnesses and victims and ask them to participate in these processes. Then on top of that, I guess the one sort of good news is that there was an arrest in the UK not that long ago of a Tamil paramilitary man who is alleged to have been responsible for the killing of a BBC journalist, whose family obviously I knew very well and had to deal with them when I first arrived in Sri Lanka. But that was a killing in 2000. So we're talking about 22 years to even get to the point of identifying the alleged killer abroad, because nothing was done in Sri Lanka and he was allowed to abscond, and arresting him and taking his passport away, and probably not doing much more than that. But at least it was a gesture and a beginning. But again, this is in a one sense, very good news that something could happen after so many years in such a high profile case, but also very, very sad for us who knew the family, because his mother had died already. She never got to see this day. And we're still yet to see anyone behind bars for killing a journalist, and one of the first journalists, you know, in a whole spate of 44, at least, journalists and media workers killed in Sri Lanka. So when you look at the push for accountability in Sri Lanka, or for Sri Lanka, externally, which is what we work on, you know, it's been a lot of work and very little achievement, I think, so far. I mean, these are symbolic victories, that you manage to file papers against somebody, or you manage to have someone arrested briefly, or you manage to get somebody to flee the country because they're worried about being arrested. It puts people on notice. Yes, it sends a message, but I'm not sure that, you know, it's anywhere commensurate with the sheer atrocity of the violence that's been meted out to victims. And, you know, they really do deserve much better than this. So I guess when I'm looking at, you know, the talk now about reform in Sri Lanka, you know, and the previous government in Sri Lanka, which talked about reform and good governance and transitional justice, and achieved very little, except in many cases putting people at risk who came forward and believed in the process. I think that what we need is a process that looks much more widely at the nature of the violence, the linkages between the different periods of history, and the fact that much of this violence is ongoing. I mean, we still see victims coming to Europe who have been tortured as recently as this year by the security forces in Sri Lanka, because they were involved in asking for justice, because they were involved in complaining about the fact that they wanted more knowledge about what happened to members of their family who disappeared. And these are people who are being abducted still by police and army and brutally tortured and raped. And that's not, you know, widely known. It's not high on the agenda, and it has never really stopped after the war. It obviously peaked massively after the civil war, but it's continued right through every government in Sri Lanka to this present day. So when you have that level of quite covert, sinister abduction, torture, ransom taking, bribery ongoing, and really overlooked to a large extent within the country, not documented within the country, then, you know, you have a very serious problem about what goes high on the agenda of your accountability work, and why at least stopping the ongoing violence isn't right up there, you know, as the top priority. And, you know, this huge gap between what's being said in Colombo in the protests, which I understand, you know, why the focus is on the economy, and the economy is really, really hurting people and really, really mismanaged. But economic mismanagement has to be seen in conjunction with, you know, people who are not just corrupt, but have also been involved in very serious violence in several cases. And the lack of rule of law for financial accountability also spills over into the lack of rule of law for atrocity crimes and torture and enforced disappearance. And those linkages aren't as strongly made as I would like to see them made at this point.
Thank you. That was a sobering presentation. And we'll move on to Vasuki. Will you please fill us in on what else is going on in Sri Lanka? Because this sounds like a kind of overwhelmingly serious set of conditions.
Yes, thanks, Susan, and thanks for hosting this event as well. I'm not going to be a ray of sunshine here either. I think also, you know, in some, but I would say that the situation is mixed. On the one hand, this level of protest and you know, demand from social mobilization outside of the political parties is also inspiring, and so, you know, something that's certainly unprecedented at this scale in post-independence Sri Lanka. So it's and certainly the government, I think, in very early on was had the view that they would just outlast the protesters, and didn't anticipate that the protests would continue this long, and be as committed to getting the Rajapaksas out. So I'm sure once we start unpacking or going into more details about different kinds of policy issues on the table, there are bound to be dramatic differences. And then people, there isn't the same consensus as there is on the sort of bottom line of getting the political leadership removed. And then there are issues of economic justice, of interethnic justice. All of those issues are bound to, expose fissures in the polity. But in some sense, I think the value of the current protests is that they interrupt politics as normal, and they allow an opportunity for people to do some unlearning and relearning. People who hadn't mixed before. Francis spoke about the fact that many in the South or Southern youth may not have known about the hardships of the war, the violence and the killings in the last phase of the war, but even the longer reach of the war. And I think it's similarly, there are many, even many people in the North as well, who may not have known about the long history of struggles around issues around economic justice that were intertwined with the struggles around interethnic justice. Whether it is of the hill country Tamils who are working in the tea plantations, issues of labor rights, and all these things. And these are, in some sense, deeply intertwined issues, but have over the last 50 years and more been seen as and treated as separate issues. And the interruption that the protests provide to politics as usual, perhaps is looking at it and optimistically, is an opportunity to sort of and relearn and redefine in some sense what the issues of the days are, what kinds of modalities people have outside of ethno-national alliances. The one thing I want to say. The other thing I want to say is actually, in some sense, about the role of the international community, and perhaps continuing with the theme of how deeply intertwined these issues are. I want to add a few different things. So, firstly, I mean, I'm of course an international law scholar and human rights. So I've been particularly focused on those issues. And, within the international human rights community, of course, we routinely invoke the Vienna Declaration that all human rights are universal, interdependent, interrelated. But in fact, the larger arc of the human rights community, not only in relation to Sri Lanka, but in general, has been to focus on civil and political rights at the expense of economic and social rights. There's been a change in the last 2 decades, I think, but from 1948 onwards, that has been the larger story, including the justice field, where I worked in actively for over 8 years. So this is an opportunity. The protest provides an opportunity as a for some kind of unlearning and relearning, and certainly working on transitional justice, constitutional reform in Sri Lanka. Also an opportunity for the international community. And I think one of the the message protests provides that the human rights community engagement with Sri Lanka has to focus not only on civil and political rights issues, but also on economic, social, and cultural rights issues, and see these things as deeply indivisible, and see these things as deeply interrelated and having knock-on effects constantly. And that's certainly the history within Sri Lanka. The first wave of disappearances, large-scale disappearances in Sri Lanka in 89 and 90, for instance, was against urban and rural Sinhala youth who were protesting against economic enfranchisement that came as a result of a whole range of open economy policies that the international community and the then government had pushed. Those issues and those students and young people were protesting those issues, and then in both in a mix of both peaceful and violent ways, and there was large-scale disappearances that resulted. So civil and political rights issues of disappearances, which Sri Lanka has one of the most sorry records in the world, issues of disappearances and issues of economic rights have constantly been intertwined in the way social movements have unfolded in Sri Lanka. And arguably even the protest of youth in the north, of Tamil youth, the initial catalyst was the right to education, was in fact issues about opportunities around anti-minority affirmative action policies, was that the government had introduced, was issues around economic opportunities post-graduation. It was those kinds of issues that motivated those protests that then led to militancy. So one thing is, it's a corrective or opportunity for the international human rights community to rethink fundamentally how it approaches human rights issues in Sri Lanka in ways that actually take seriously this as a learning moment, not only with Sri Lanka, but outside, right? So that these are learning moments in Geneva, in New York, in London, elsewhere. So that's sort of the one thing I wanted to say. The second thing is that there is a intertwining and this is both within Sri Lanka and externally, is that the issues around Sinhala Buddhist nationalism and majoritarianism in Sri Lanka are deeply intertwined with questions of authoritarianism, economic exploitation. Before we started, Susan, we spoke briefly about that other session we have had on the IMF and so on, the issues that came up. For instance, the issue of the military. Now, questions about how we decide what should be prioritized in the budget. The military budget is both an expression of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, the ways in which the government has held on to power in ways that have combined a particular authoritarian culture with economic exploitation. That it is it is precisely the power relationships that has enabled, that have allowed Rajapaksas to loot the economy in a whole range of ways. So that perhaps is a second point. I have a couple of other things I want to mention, but I just want to check in, Susan, about time. I have lost track of time, as I often do. So, sorry.
You're doing fine.
Okay. So then I'll say a couple of other things. I'll be brief. So another, I think this is an opportunity. I mean, thinking of moving to the economy, that this is an opportunity to rethink. I think Sri Lanka, people have argued, is sort of the canary in the coal mine in terms of sovereign debt crisis, and that sovereign debt crisis is going to be an issue all over the global south, in many parts of the world. And in that, I think there is an argument for rethinking how debt is approached. I mean, Sri Lanka may therefore be a good context in which to approach questions of sovereign debt differently. And so this is a question not only for economists, but also for international lawyers, for international economic lawyers, in how we think about restructuring debt and who bears the cost of that restructuring. There has been a movement in recent years for thinking of the concept of odious debt, when debt has been negotiated by odious governments, not in the interests of the people that they represent, but in terms of their own interests, for corruption and for other things, that those debts have to be put differently, and the obligations of the debtor and the debt should be different. There's no reason why the Sri Lankan people have to bear the cost for bad deals that the Rajapaksas made for their own interests with international lenders who also did it for their own interests. The odious debt has been used. Some of you may have seen the recent spate of articles in the New York Times about Haiti and historic debt. Odious debt was invoked in apartheid South Africa, and was invoked in relation to Chile after Pinochet, in a whole range of different contexts. Historically, the international community has been very hostile to using odious debt as a reason to revisit conditions of terms of debt. But I think this moment, when the pandemic has produced a economic crisis globally, and many respected economists, people like Joseph Stiglitz and others, have argued for attention to the category of odious debt as a way in which to rethink sovereign debt obligations. That is true, I think, in the Sri Lankan context as well. And Sri Lanka being, being sort of the first country to sort of implode under these combinations of crisis of sort of local authoritarianism and economic mismanagement, with sort of an international unfair world order, economically unfair world order, that has produced these kinds of problematic debt burdens that are borne by very vulnerable and precarious populations, that it may be a time to revisit that. And so relatedly, the other thing I want to say about thinking about the economy is that, in Sri Lanka, because of the gross corruption, of the scale of the corruption of the Rajapaksas, is a certain tendency from to refer to economists to embrace technocracy, as if in some sense there wasn't a politics to economics. And all of the issues at stake now in relation to the policy trade-offs that are going to be negotiated with the IMF are deeply political issues. And this is a moment where social movements, where unions, where the most precarious economic actors need to have a say. And it may mean that the IMF also, and as many people within the IMF are also beginning perhaps to rethink, have to address differently. Sri Lanka has a long history of social welfare policies around education, free health, and the current precarity people experience should not be exacerbated with more austerity policies. And the human rights community has come out very strongly. The former special rapporteur, my colleague Philip Alston at NYU, special rapporteur for looking at questions of extreme poverty, has argued that we should look at the role of IFIs, of privatization, as deeply political issues where human rights need to be centered. So, to the extent that the ABA is also a community of international lawyers engaging on all these international economic issues, this is also an opportunity in some sense to push for those kinds of priorities and to push against, in some sense, the deregulation of financing and so on, contributed in the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. And finally, perhaps a very last thing I want to say about the international community is that the international community has, the things that has been pushed in the last 2 decades is notion of democracy promotion. And I think one of the things that the protests in Sri Lanka, just like the protests Arab Spring, protests in Chile, protests in Lebanon, and a whole range of different countries have pushed, is that we need to rethink what democracy means, that it is not something that is top down, that's pushed by the international community, but something that's actually the right to dissent, the right to public assembly. It's something that needs to be grounded in local social movements. And I think that also the current Sri Lankan context is an opportunity for the international community to engage both in the Sri Lankan context, but also perhaps more generally differently. So, okay, sorry, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I think you've given us the basis for at least 3 or 4 additional programs, for which I'm very grateful. A lot of ideas to follow up on. I want to reintroduce Gihan and to let the audience know that he is now a postdoctoral fellow at Pembroke College, Oxford, in religion and the frontier challenges.
Thank you very much, Susan, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak today. So we're obviously talking about opportunities for constitutional reform and transitional justice. And I think moments of crisis like the one we're experiencing in Sri Lanka, where people collectively come to a realization that systemic change is needed, I think present unique opportunities for reform. And I think I agree with Francis's assessment that not often do people realize what that systemic reform looks like, and it's up to civil society to engage on that subject. But I want to reflect today about what can potentially prevent us from seizing that opportunity. And this is where I think we can tie the present crisis in Sri Lanka to its continuing failure to secure accountability for human rights abuses during and after the armed conflict, right? And I want to reflect on some of the more systemic parallels that we can see between the two experiences. The present experience of economic and political crisis and that continuing experience of transitional justice, or shall we say the lack thereof. And these are ultimately tales of 2 types of government. And we are seeing the same terrible oscillation taking place in both experiences. And this is what I want to try and touch on today. Let's turn first to the present crisis, right? we have the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, the SLPP as a party, becoming hugely attractive and popular by mid-2019, especially after the Easter Sunday attacks, right? And there was a public perception that the previous Yahapalani or good governance government under Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe and President Maithripala Sirisena had come to a point of policy paralysis, so much so that it couldn't ensure even basic national security. That was the narrative. And following Easter Sunday, and helped by an extremely effective public relations machine, we saw popular mandates handed to Gotabaya Rajapaksa in 2019 and the SLPP in 2020. Now then, the government embarks on a disastrous series of decisions that directly bring us to this position here today. It begins by introducing radical tax cuts, resulting in huge loss of tax revenue. That prompts international rating agencies to downgrade Sri Lanka and virtually cut the country out of capital markets. And we see this extraordinary response from the government, where it beats its chest and engages in the most peculiar theatrics of intransigence. It dismisses the rating agencies. It claims that it has homegrown solutions to any crisis and that it'll be confident that China would support it no matter what. Fast forward a year, and then we're in a full-blown economic crisis. And again, calls to seek international support, restructure debt, they're all resisted by the government, with no real explanation other than for strange, outdated, and ill-informed ideological positions mostly. More bravado, more intransigence, and now I would even say plain idiocy. The public reaction to the government's mismanagement and incompetence, I think, has been unambiguous. Vasuki's already gone through that. We've seen now more than 50 days of sustained public protests, and all of it is demanding for the president to resign. And we've already seen progress in terms of actual change. We've had a central bank governor resign. We've had a former finance minister, Basil Rajapaksa, the president's brother, resign. We've had the prime minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa, resign. We've had other Rajapaksas in the family also resign. And it's only the president that is currently holding out. And somehow, as Sri Lankan politics would have it, we end up with a new prime minister who is Ranil Wickremesinghe, and the same prime minister that was previously the face of the Yahapalani government, which the SLPP positioned itself as polar opposite to. So in a sense, we are back at a point where Wickremesinghe himself as a lone actor, the former president Sirisena's SLFP, and an SLPP now headed by Gotabaya Rajapaksa, in this strange coalition, and a coalition that promises to take the country out of the present crisis. Now, a lot of us, admittedly, would be hoping that they succeed because of the sheer intensity and magnitude of this economic crisis. But I think Sri Lanka's transitional justice experience might explain why there's cause for a lot of pessimism. So when the armed conflict ended in 2009, that government, a previous incarnation of the SLPP, it was the UPFA government, enjoyed incredible popularity in the South and won landslide elections in 2010. With that came absolute intransigence at international fora. Many of us who were involved in that process remember that the prevailing theory was that Sri Lanka does not need to cooperate with the international community because its so-called allies, including China, would support it. Homegrown solutions are the only solutions worth considering. And from around 2012, when a series of UN Human Rights Council resolutions were passed, and there was mounting pressure on the government to deliver accountability and reconciliation, or else face the prospect of an international justice mechanism. The response of the government was to act with total intransigence, bravado, and it didn't even bother to implement the recommendations of its own Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, which many had already dismissed as sort of eyewash. And as time went on, the pressure became insurmountable, unsustainable, and then the UPFA government eventually loses its popularity for a number of reasons. mostly its own corruption. And with that exit came this incredible moment of hope for many people, where transitional justice became possible under a good governance regime. And that is the regime that the UNP and SLFP coalition government under Wickremesinghe and Sirisena delivered. Now, if one can describe that UPFA government as intransigent, I think the Yahapalana government can be described as both indecisive and insincere. There were, of course, some exceptions, and some may recall that people like Mangala Samaraweera may have believed in the reforms he championed, but I don't think I would extend that claim to any other political actor that was involved in the transitional justice project at the time. There was a plan put forward and no real intention to implement it. It was very much a process of buying time and managing international actors, and victims were being strung along, right? Time and again, we saw committees upon committees appointed to draft laws. Then we had drafts stuck in endless deliberations, often before cabinet. I myself served on some of those committees and have deep regrets about my naivety. And then we ended up with just the Office on Missing Persons, which was supposed to be one of 4 mechanisms set up under the plan, as the only mechanism that was properly set up to function. The Reparations Office was never really got off the ground. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission law was drafted, but it was killed by the then Prime Minister's office, and the draft never saw the light of day. And then a domestic accountability mechanism, don't even begin to talk about it, it became a non-starter. So we saw this pattern developing in the transitional justice experience of Sri Lanka. And even beyond the transitional justice experience, we saw that same kind of vacillation and overcomplication and eventual paralysis when it came to ambitious constitutional reform. And that was during that period between 2016 and 2017. And then one begins to wonder whether this hallmark of overcomplication and paralysis is actually a sort of deliberately infused system of marring oneself with complexity. So it seems like you're doing a lot, but ending up like you're doing very little. And if there's one thing we can learn from Sri Lanka's awful transitional justice experience, I think it is that we need to reject both types of this government, both the intransigent type and the indecisive, insincere type. Because I think both types of government ultimately resist meaningful change. One did it overtly, and the other does it more covertly. And that is precisely what we can expect of this new coalition government today. It is already evident that that we are seeing some of the indecisiveness and insincerity from this present coalition government. For example, the so-called 21st Amendment bill that has been presented before cabinet is already becoming a matter of theatrics rather than genuine reform. And it all feels extremely familiar. And what I suspect, although I hope I'm mistaken, is that we will once again be subjected to a series of false promises where the nature of the coalition is blamed for the lack of progress, and ultimately a lot of time and effort are spent on achieving very little. So where do we go from here, and what can we do to avoid the huge opportunity costs of dealing with indecisive and insincere governments? And I think it boils down to revisiting our theory of change. And I'm going to end with this thought. I think reformers within civil society and in the international community constantly buy into promises of political actors, because often we have no choice. And often we don't hold them to their word in terms of sustained political messaging. When it comes to transitional justice, I think this is very clear. Our measure of progress did not sufficiently factor in how much effort political actors and political leaders particularly put into creating public demand. And I mean particularly in the South of the country, the majority community, for justice. In the absence of that major communication effort, I think we are rest assured that everything will be designed to buy time and nothing will be done in good faith. Because there's this sense that we can never sell this to the majority community, and no one even makes an attempt. So that identical expectation needs to be placed on any government promising extensive constitutional reform. Because I think if a government is not willing to take this to the majority community and convince it and do the hard yards of selling the importance of transitional justice and constitutional reform, I can guarantee you the project is doomed to failure, and the project is not sincere to begin with. So the theory of change has to incorporate a major shift in political messaging and some clear, concrete action. No more committees, no more endless drivel about future plans. And I think the catch is that if we are to seize this unique political opportunity for reform, including a renewed conversation on transitional justice, I think we need to talk about electoral transition as well. There can be no meaningful reform until we break out of this back and forth between the political elites, between intransigent governments and indecisive governments. And that means we first need to elect a new type of government to work with, which is neither intransigent nor insincere, and which is why I think, I'll end with this thought, if we want to seize this opportunity, we have to demand elections first and present a new government with a very clear popular mandate for reform. Thank you.
If we have questions from the audience, will you put them in the chat, please? So I have a question, and that is, how do you find a party of reformers, of people who are not either ineffectual or corrupt? It seems like there have been promises on both sides that haven't been kept. How do you forge a new path?
Is that question for me, or is it for everyone?
It's for any of the panelists who would like to address it. But why don't we start with you, since you raised the issue?
No, I think this is a very difficult question to answer, and I think as someone who's thinking about this critically, I can see that without sincerity, without good faith, we are not going to get any further on these reform agendas. And I think we've all been involved quite intimately in transitional justice work and in constitutional reform, and we've all had to do the unthinkable, which is to trust political actors. But I think we've got better at now understanding the political economy landscape in Sri Lanka. And I think the damage that we do to victim groups, to people who really rely on promises being kept, is incredible. And it's time we stop engaging in this sort of ritual or theatrics or dance with political actors that we know have a track record of breaking promises. So which is why if I were to put my efforts in change, I would look at a much longer term project of trying to change political culture. I'd look at education reform. I'd look at working with young people and trying to develop leadership that's different. And that's an enormously difficult project. So there's no panacea to the problem I'm pointing to. But I think we need to stop legitimizing governments that are dishonest. And that's a huge step that we probably have to take at some point.
Francis.
I'd say, it's not just a question of politicians that break promises. There are politicians who have blood on their hands or have stolen, and those people need to be held criminally accountable. And it's the continuous failure to do that over decades that means you've got this degenerative, political process and leadership. It's a failure of political leadership. So when you look back at the 1989 period, there were presidential commissions of inquiry that looked into mass enforced disappearance and named alleged perpetrators, suspects basically, and named hundreds of them in the police force, in the political class, people who are still politicians, and also in the army. And those lists are sitting in government archives under an official secrets ban for another 10 years. And nobody's actually, even in civil society, said, okay, let's publish those lists. Let's know who these people are. This was a government commission of inquiry. You should have qualified privilege to publish those names. And yet it's been suppressed by successive governments. And now, you have a government in power that has no interest in publishing that yet again. So at least let's know who was responsible for violence in the past. And, in terms of vetting and screening for violent acts in the past and also corruption, I mean, look at in 2019, we started looking at the cabinet and the people in cabinet who were appointed who still had ongoing court cases against them in the Sri Lankan system. They hadn't yet been dropped. You can't appoint someone to be a cabinet minister who's still fighting off an allegation of corruption, and yet there were several of them. So, it is absolutely I don't think it's about broken promises at all. It's about having a justice system either inside or outside the country that functions, reasonably adequately, that can hold these people accountable. And once you start to pick them off for the crimes they've committed, then, okay, you're left with slightly better people, we hope, and a younger generation definitely younger, who are not so mired in this dreadful political culture of protecting each other's backs. And that's what's going on now. I mean, you're talking about, Gahan is talking about two different styles of government, the intransigent Rajapaksas and the indecisive and insecure UMP, etc. But although they have different characters, I mean, it is almost like a rebranding exercise. They do seem to manage to support one another, to back each other, to do a little bit of accountability, but just so much as to have someone arrested for a week and then they get bail, and then they get away with it. They don't really go for any of the serious crimes that their opponents have committed. They go for an illegal demonstration or something quite small compared to the vast. I mean, it's really quite surreal compared to some of the things these people are alleged to have done. So I think really what you're talking about is using the information that's already out there to be much more hard-hitting about who you target, going for individuals, because this is a small country with a small political class. Unless you know the track record of every single person in that and you know what they're doing, you can't really unpick what a government's doing. So when you look back at the good governance period and you talk about them being indecisive and insincere, I think you saw their insincerity from the very beginning in some of the people they appointed. So it's not just about policy, it's about individuals in a place as small as Sri Lanka. So if you have the transitional justice championing government also promoting someone who's an alleged war criminal as chief of army staff or adjutant general of the army who's in charge of human rights and the law, then you really ought to be calling that out from the very beginning. Or when they send somebody who's alleged to have run a torture site to sit on the UN Committee Against Torture in Geneva, civil society and others ought to be calling that out from the outset, because it's not just about policy change, about setting up mechanisms, it's also about the individuals that are going to run those mechanisms in a place like Sri Lanka, and that was never called out. So I think, until you start to look at individuals, name and shame, look at the work that's already been done on that, I don't see the political culture in Sri Lanka changing.
We have two questions that follow up very nicely. From Tom Valenti, according to the United Nations, the 4 key pillars of transitional justice are truth, justice, reparation, and guarantee of non-recurrence. How is the last one addressed by reformers?
Perhaps I can on this one. I mean, I don't think we should have that the narrow reading of transitional justice as our only menu of options in some sense. So all of those are important. The guarantee of non-recurrence has increasingly been used to address both institutional reform, which is absolutely needed, security sector reform, as well as addressing background issues like economic issues as well that address questions of disenfranchisement. I think in some sense, the actions of some of the protesters are much greater to not only address those things, but to see these as interlinked with a whole range of other things. I do think, in some sense, I agree with the other speakers that both governments have both terrible human rights records and terrible records in violence. So if just as the Rajapaksas were responsible for the horrific violations of the last of the war, the UNP was also responsible both for many violations throughout the course of the war, but also for, of course, the disappearances of over 30,000 people from the 89 and 90 period. So neither has clean hands, nor the LTT, which of course is no more. Certainly accountability for all of that is important. Linked, I think, with for we're thinking about non-recurrence, with really empowering the social movements in a whole range of ways. So, one of the key demands, and Gahan can speak much more to this, is about publishing of the executive presidency as just one example that is both illustrative of the way in which you need the space of dissent to prevent recurrence, but it also expresses a centralization of power that has embedded within it both authoritarian and majoritarian histories and logics that have historically been part of what has allowed human rights violations and accountability to occur and to be defeated.
We have a question from Rohan. Forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Edrinisa. On prospects for constitutional reform, Gahan said that a first step should be elections. Isn't there a danger in conducting parliamentary elections with Gotabaya Rajapaksa in situ as president? Should there not be presidential elections as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it would be ideal if you can have two elections and a total change. I think the pressure for the incumbent president to resign has to continue because the way I read the law on the subject, there is no ability to have an early presidential election. Even if we remove the president through say impeachment or resignation or through some way, there'll be an interim period in which someone else occupies that position. So I think you may need to push for resignation, and if you don't get that, you don't get that. And currently, the new government that has been installed with Ranil Wickremesinghe as Prime Minister is not going to push for Gotabaya Rajapaksa to resign. In fact, their whole existence, I think, is for the preservation of Gotabaya Rajapaksa as president. And now we're hearing already the new Justice Minister, Vijayadasa Rajapaksa, who incidentally is not a relation, saying that, if Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigns, then his brother Basil might end up being president because of the way in which parliament is currently composed, and you might have the SLPP vote in Basil as the interim president until the term ends. So there are all kinds of fear-mongering going around about what could happen if he resigns. I just think we're in this impasse that we will continue to be unless we change the configuration of parliament. Because as we all know, the configuration of parliament has SLPP with a massive majority. And there's very little an opposition can do in that context. And there's a lot of criticism of the opposition at the moment. And I think a lot of the criticism is valid, but a lot of it is not valid because you have an opposition with barely 50 seats. And if you want reform to stick, you need a popular mandate for it. And you can't get a popular mandate for it without at least demanding for elections and pushing for the dissolution of parliament. That is very risky. And I take Mr. Edrisinghe's point about the risks of having Gotabaya Rajapaksa in situ with parliament dissolved. But I think we're already having a situation in which the president will sit out the rest of his term because the present configuration in parliament would protect him, and the prime minister and the government will also protect him. And there's no way we can really hope for any kind of radical change without changing that configuration in parliament. So unfortunately, the opposition has to change its rhetoric and now be prepared for an election and at least push for an election. And I think the protesters, in addition to demanding Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigns, can demand an election, because an election is the first way in which you reset and you can have a government with some kind of legitimacy, because right now the government lacks popular legitimacy. And there's no way we can see these parliamentarians and politicians doing anything other than preserve their interest in this situation. And I don't see a way out of this without an election.
We have a wonderful last question from Mohan Ram. The core issue of Sri Lanka is the way Tamil people were treated since. The amount of energy and money Sri Lankan government spent on fighting Tamils, and then the opportunity cost the Tamil people should have brought to the country should be strongly considered. Without that, Sri Lanka will continue to be stuck in a cycle and continue to be a failed state. I request each candidate to reflect on the way to go forward in terms of how to go about getting the Tamil genocide recognized, apologized by the Sri Lankan government, remedial justice followed by reparation, and a political solution based on the Tamil people's right to self-determination. Anybody want to handle that? First of all, do our speakers agree that that is one of the bases of the current issues? And
I mean,
Sri
I
Lanka.
can make one quick comment, Susan, and I think I agree with Vasuki's earlier position or point about the need for some important constitutional reform to go through, including the abolition of the executive presidency. But if you look at the core issues, if you look at the grievances that have led us to this point, some of those problems occurred well before the executive presidency was brought in, starting with language, standardization of university admissions. All of these problems come from deep majoritarian entitlement and existential fears about minorities. And while I think the executive presidency is a symptom of that problem, taking it away is very important, but we are not going to have systemic change merely by taking that out. I think we need to address some of the more deeply rooted problems, which are sociocultural, and transforming that will take much more than constitutional reform. So while I'm very in favor of constitutional reform and I'm in favor of abolishing the executive presidency, I think the problems that animate this conflict are much deeper than the constitution. And I think it's going to take a lot of effort if we're going to really transform society in Sri Lanka. And I just don't think the current political culture is conducive for that. So which goes back to my point. If we're serious about any of this, we need to really invest an enormous amount of time and effort into changing that culture. And just one last point. I mean, I agree that individual accountability is also important, but like constitutional reform, I would say that has to be in tandem and parallel to deeper transformational project, which no one really wants to invest in, but it has to be done. Yeah.
Thank you. Francis, would you like to address the question or a related question, which is, what is the most crucial aspect we should keep in mind as we go forward?
I'll try and do a bit of both. I think what worries me is the idea that elections, majoritarian elections, I mean, again, in a country with, as Gehan put it, majoritarian entitlement, are going to produce a solution. And when you have a political class that cooperate with one another, protect one another, you're just going to get a reshuffle through elections at the moment without some sort of more systemic change. I think in terms of recognition of the suffering that Tamils in Sri Lanka and now Muslims have experienced, and Sinhalese in the past at the hands of the security forces, there has been, I think the good governance period was really problematic in terms of the way that it addressed some of these issues like reconciliation. I mean, there was reconciliation without any truth. The reconciliation, from my mind, from the victims I saw who were the worst affected, who fled the country, these were people who were tortured, raped, extorted from, and had already experienced the horrors of war, and then were driven out of the country. So then you drive all your worst enemies out of the country, and then you say, oh, they weren't really tortured, and you deny them, any kind of dignity, and then you talk about reparations and reconciliation, and that's just, a bit like the kind of appalling rhetoric of the humanitarian operation, which was supposed to be what the army were doing when they were operating a scorched earth policy, fighting the LTT in 2009. Reconciliation and many of these terms that were used in Sri Lanka have become so denuded of value, and there were so much donor-driven terms, really, that it is quite obscene the way that they've been used. But of course, they've been internalized in civil society and in society more widely. And, I think on the Tamil side, you hear a lot of people abroad saying kind of reconciliation, that's rubbish, transitional justice, that's awful, because they've seen the way it's been denuded and they don't understand what these concepts are supposed to look like. And certainly reparations and apology. And those are the lowest things we found on the agenda for victims abroad. They were quite horrified by the idea that there was anything like that that could make up for what they'd been through. So I think, there is a real process of truth-telling that needs to happen. And people in the South need to know, and not just in the South, I mean, many Tamils abroad and in adjacent areas need to know a lot more about what happened in 2009 or what's happening now to Muslims, or even what happened in 89 and the similarities. And, one thing we found, for example, we were organizing a meeting like this a while back, and we looked for a simultaneous Tamil translator who could translate, speeches by lawyers and transitional justice experts, in other words, quite complicated English language, simultaneously into Tamil. And we couldn't find anybody who would do that. I mean, short of people in the Sri Lankan parliament who obviously couldn't work on something like this. So that was Tamil. And as for Sinhala, we still haven't found anyone out there who might be able to do it for us, who has that experience of doing it live. We ended up with people from India doing the Tamil translation. So, how do you speak to each other? How do you have these conversations about things like transitional justice if you can't do it with live simultaneous translation very, very easily? That's a real problem if you're going forward and you're a Tamil, like I think it was Mohan, who wants people in the rest of Sri Lanka to understand what happened. There's still a huge project to explain what happened to people. And I'm quite shocked that, I wrote a book in 2011 and Tamils are still reading that book, and people in Sri Lanka to understand what happened in the war. I thought by now there'd be a lot more books by Sinhalese and by Tamils explaining, their history of the war. And there's so little ability for people to come forward, particularly survivors of the war 13 years later, and safely, even abroad, and safely say, I went through these terrible experiences, because they have families in Sri Lanka, because they fear repercussions. So you don't hear from people who really have that lived experience, even when they're safe abroad, because they're still too terrified about the consequences for their families. And these sort of issues need to be addressed when you're talking about transitional justice. It's not only a policy thing, it's not setting up OMP and different offices. It's whether people still feel safe, whether there's ongoing violence. If they're not safe abroad to speak, then how can they possibly engage in these processes properly in the north of Sri Lanka today?
Vasuki, would you like the last word?
Sure, honestly, as a last word, but perhaps the one thing to say was that, I guess in response to Mohan's question, I think that the questions around in the injustices, violence as well as discrimination have faced is also one that Muslims have faced, Tamils have faced also at the hands of the LTT. And any truth-telling process needs to, in that sense, open in ways that actually engage with those histories of violence, not only 2009, so the longer histories that they have been with decades, and has to link, in some sense, questions of minority rights with questions of economic justice fundamentally, and that those cannot be entangled. And I agree that I don't, as the silver, you can't have constitutional reform alone is not going to reform things. Individual accountability is not going to reform things. You can't hold Derek Chauvin responsible for George Floyd's death and then think that you have just a problem of racism in the United States. similarly, you can't have individual accountability in Sri Lanka of, an army commander here or a navy commander there and think you're going to address the problem of majoritarianism. So you need, in some sense, a much more complex reading of the situation and a much more complex response. So there's a lot to do.
Thank you. And if I can impose on our speakers to, in the next day or two, provide us with a list of materials we can send out to the people who registered for this seminar so that we can all be better informed and make an effort to learn more about what's going on in Sri Lanka and current thinking on efforts that can be made internationally to assist. Thank you so much. This has been a very moving and impactful education. And I want to thank you all on behalf of the International Criminal Law Committee of the ABA for spending your time with us and sharing your knowledge and experience with us this morning.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.